Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 605 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the last 6 stories from the book The Best of Greg Egan. And those stories are Crystal Knights, Zero for Conduct, Uncanny Valley, Bit Players, 3 Attica, and Instantiation. And this will include spoilers for all of those stories, so just be aware of that. And this is a follow-up to our previous discussions of The Best of Greg Egan back in episodes 592 and 604, so definitely check those out if you missed them. And I'm joined today by my good friend Anthony Ha, making his 33rd appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and in the chapbook Love Songs for Monsters. And his story A Brief History of the Afterlife recently appeared in the March-April issue of Asimov's magazine. He currently works as weekend editor at TechCrunch, and is a co-host of the podcast Original Content. And now here's our interview with Anthony Ha. All right, so we're here with Anthony Ha. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Okay, and so the first story in this batch is called Crystal Knights. So in this story, there's like a rich tech bro named Daniel, and he's got some super new computer processor, which is described as, quote, a single 3-dimensional photonic crystal. And it means he's going to be able to make massive AI advancements using this new technology. And so in the opening scene, he's called in Julie, who's like a top AI researcher, and is showing off his new photonic crystal thing and trying to get her to come work for him. But in the course of the conversation, he mentions that he's planning to develop his AIs using evolutionary processes. So he's going to essentially recapitulate the entire history of evolution to get human-level intelligences. And she's horrified by this because if all these simulated minds in the computer are sentient, then you're going to be essentially recapitulating all the pain and fear and everything that was involved in the whole history of evolution on Earth as part of this experiment, and she wants no part of that. And so that's kind of how the story kicks off. So Anthony, what did you think overall of Crystal Knights?
I enjoyed reading it, but I think as a story, it's pretty kind of ungainly, and it felt like, in a way that I think not too many other stories, I think we've complained about some of the other stories that feel a little undercooked on sort of the fictional stuff, and this maybe felt like one of the more extreme versions of that, where I just felt like, like Julie, for example, is this character who's introduced in the first scene, and it seems like she has this role to play as a critic of what Daniel is doing. And then she just kind of disappears. I think she's mentioned one other time. There's another kind of character, Lucien, who's involved in the experiment, and he doesn't really have much personality. And Daniel's motivations are sort of clear, but not. I think like at one point, Lucien towards the end kind of criticizes him for being kind of paranoid and obsessed with this idea of like some sort of big war coming. And again, it just felt like there were all these pieces that were individually interesting, but that like I really liked the idea of the fights. I liked, some of the scenes of just seeing their society develop, and then Daniel kind of interacting with them. The fights being the kind of simulated beings in this.
Yeah, and this is
world. Fights,
PHITES.
Yeah, and in fact, there's there's also this one scene where Daniel, I assume sort of a deliberate parallel to sort of like biblical stories of like, say, God appearing to mortals and basically saying, hey, I created you, now you have to do what I say. And so there's so much good stuff in this story when I look back at it, but I found it pretty unsatisfying as a story, I would say.
Yeah, I thought this was the weakest story in the book. Because as you say, yeah, the characters just felt very one-dimensional. It just felt like they were being used as mouthpieces to explore ideas, but didn't really have much in the way of personality, and the dialogue didn't, to me, feel very naturalistic or believable at all. So yeah, I was not a huge fan of this one. Sort of what happens in the plot as it develops is that uh, Daniel goes ahead and develops his simulation, and he gets these kind of giant crab like beings within the computer simulation who evolve to be kind of human level intelligence. And at some point he starts reading some of their poetry or something and starts having second thoughts a little bit, and says to Lucian, his right hand man, like, I want to make them immortal. I don't want them dying anymore. And Lucian tells him, well, if they're not dying, then they're going to just reproduce out of control, and they'll quickly fill up more disk space than we have, or crystal space, I guess, whatever. And Daniel says, well, in that case, so let's just make them sterile. And so then it's the big like crisis within the fights society, like, why have we all gone sterile, and is there any way to fix it and stuff like that. So yeah, there are interesting ideas like that, but I just felt, I think one thing is that the story, it just felt like the author doesn't like Daniel. And so I just had the very strong sense from the beginning, like, oh, this experiment is not going to go well, and he's going to be punished for doing this evil experiment and stuff. So I felt like kind of there wasn't a whole lot of suspense or ambiguity. Actually, the ending ended up being a little bit less punitive than I had expected. Basically, what happens at the end is that the fights kind of they trick Daniel and figure out some way to like escape from his computer simulation through a wormhole or something. But at the end, he's kind of undeterred and is just thinking about the next simulation that he's going to set up. So it didn't feel like anything really changed or anybody really learned anything or anything like that. Do you agree with that, Anthony?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And then there's this whole thing where Lucian says, oh, I'm quitting because I'm going to go work in particle physics. And again, all of that just, it's not that it's totally incomprehensible, but it feels like there's no sense of investment or stakes in any of this. I'm like, that's fine. I don't care if Lucian is leaving or not. And so again, it just felt like this was a story that is, I think maybe, other people might think of like some of the other Greg Egan stories this way, but I feel like this is the only one that I would really say just feels like it's a bunch of ideas put into a story and then not really turned into a successful story, including the ending.
Yeah, it feels like a rough draft in a way that none of the other stories do. So yeah, I'm not really sure what was going on with this one. One thing I'll say is that these first four stories we're going to talk about all have puns or something for titles. So Crystal Nights, obviously it's like you're spending your nights in this crystal, it's called Sapphire, the simulated, the computer simulation is called Sapphire. But it also seems to be a reference to Kristallnacht, one of the infamous nights of anti-Jewish violence in Germany leading up to the Holocaust. Kristallnacht literally means crystal night. So I if that's intentional, I think we're supposed to take, there's supposed to be this valence of sinister experiments or, treating innocent people in some horrible way or something. But I don't know. Like, it just never came together there were interesting, weighty themes in the mix, but it just never really came together for me.
Right. In some ways, the most interesting way to read the story is more just sort of in the light of some of the other stories that we're going to be talking about today, because definitely reading Crystal Knights and then how in the opening scene, Daniel presents his plan for, developing this sort of digital AI society, and Julie immediately is horrified and says, wow, you're going to have all these sentient beings, you're going to let them live and die and suffer. I can't be a part of that. And I felt like there were so many assumptions built into that. And I was like, oh, I don't know that I have that same kind of revulsion or immediate, moral indignation about that. And I felt like in this story, they didn't really draw that out enough. But then he wrote, 3 novellas later on where I'm like, oh, right, that is kind of, at least if, the digital humans or the sentient beings on the computer reach a certain level. That is actually horrifying. And in a much more successful way, spoiler for, I guess, later reviews, he's able to explore that idea. Whereas in Crystal Knights, again, there's some interesting bits, like both in terms of how the society evolves, also in terms of like the ways that they try to connect the digital world and the physical world, so that at a later stage, which is essentially is how the fights kind of escape Daniel, is they sort of create an experimental like space where basically the fights can be, even though they're on this crystal, they can be controlling, real world experimental technology. And I found like all of that like very cool and again interesting to think about after I'd read Bit Players and Threatica, but on its own, yeah, not so much.
Yeah, so I guess we should explain. So the reason Daniel wants these fights specifically is because he sees in the real world that some sort of war is brewing, and he wants this some sort of scientific brain trust in his control. And since the fights are simulated on a computer, he can run them. He can run their civilization at an accelerated rate. So he's hoping to get advanced scientific breakthroughs out of running this simulation. But in order for them to do any real science, he has to give them access to lab equipment that exists outside the simulation in the real world. And it's through this, and he's trying to control it as much as possible. But they're able, again, to figure out a way to create a wormhole and escape. And it sort of brings up some of the issues involving, AI safety and, could you ever, keep it contained, no matter how hard you try. But yeah, you're right that 4 out of the 6 stories that we're going to talk about today basically deal with this issue of simulated people within a computer environment and the issues of, of them being free or not. So I hope you like that topic because you're going to be getting a whole lot of it. And I guess I didn't actually look this up, but at some point around here, Greg Egan, I know, wrote a novel called Permutation City, which is, at least from what I gather, sort of reputed to be one of the best treatments of this question of people or minds who exist in a computer simulation and what that would mean. So I don't know if if some of these stories were kind of building up to that, or he had already written it and he was just exploring some of the little nooks and crannies that he had left unexplored in the novel, or something like that. But certainly he has done better treatments of the subject than Crystal Knights.
Yeah, I think Permutation City, I think, came before all of these stories. So it seems like maybe he did a big treatment of it, but then the idea sort of didn't fully let him go. And it is interesting, just thinking about the whole book, the whole best of collection. Like you can see these very, and not that there's like necessarily a hard border, but you can sense that there are at different periods in his career topics that he is, I don't think it's too strong to say obsessed with. That he, at the beginning, he's very obsessed with the idea of sort of like, where does our morality, where does our sense of self come from? And then at a certain point, he starts to become more interested in the idea of the many worlds theory. And then sort of when he's writing these stories, he's not exclusively, but to a very large extent, interested in the idea of, digital consciousness in virtual worlds.
Yeah, he was also early on obsessed with the first-person point of view.
Right.
And I don't know if you noticed, but all of the stories in this batch are third person. So like last episode, first episode we had 0 third person. Last episode we had 1, and this time we have all 6. So I don't know what explains that shift. I wonder if he was just like, all right, I gotta like master the third person point of view. And I don't know, sometimes when you shift something like that, it takes a little while to get comfortable again.
Yeah.
The other thing I saw that was kind of interesting was that apparently Sam Altman, who's the head of OpenAI, did an interview on Ezra Klein's podcast where he recommended Crystal Knights, like he recommended people read it. So I don't know. It's interesting that, that science fiction like this is getting out there and at least being read by people doing the AI stuff now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that actually, I mean, that is like interesting and cool, although it's a little bit disappointing that the sort of weakest story, and I agree with you, I think it's either the weakest or one of the weakest stories in the book. So one of the weakest stories Greg Egan has written, certainly recently, is the one
Hey, Sam Altman, did you read Oceanic?
Yeah, come on. Come on, Sam.
Did you read Learning to Be Me? Come on, Sam. Get with it.
But also that I think this also brings up one of the things, I think you've brought this up on other episodes of the podcast, but that it feels like science fiction has not dealt very directly or successfully with this question of essentially what would the threshold be where we would essentially say, yes, this is real sentience, this is real consciousness to a digital being. Because I think what we haven't, I mean, he sort of portrays it a little bit in the later stories, is it the idea, we haven't, not a lot of writers, I think, wrote about this idea that you'd have all this technology that can essentially imitate consciousness without sort of any sort of meaningful internal insight. And so, like, how would you actually tell the difference between one or the other? How would we morally, legally, ethically say, yes, you are, and no, you are not? I mean, I think sometimes, there are, stories that deal with that. Like, I mean, there's like a famous Star Trek Next Generation episode, but it kind of always starts from the place of, oh, these are essentially human beings in robotic bodies, and we just need to recognize that, as opposed from starting from the place of, oh, we created all these technologies that kind of sound human, but are they human, and how would we figure that out? And I think Greg Egan deals with it more than other writers, but I'm still not 100% satisfied with any of the answers in these stories.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's been my big thing with AI in science fiction, is that, I read a thing one time that science fiction can only deal with robots basically as either like killer robots or like the next civil rights movement, basically, and nothing besides that, nothing in between. But it seems to me, as I've said in the past, that an underexplored, story in science fiction is, how do we deal with intelligent machines that people feel are human but actually aren't, are actually just what we call philosophical zombies, have no inner life at all, or just, are just pure behavior. And so, yeah, I guess in that sense, I'm a little disappointed with Crystal Knights that it doesn't delve into that. It takes, like most science fiction does, the presumption that any sort of intelligence within a computer would just be just as conscious as any biologically based consciousness or intelligence, which I feel is probably almost certainly not true.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, again, it's not that it fully skirts this story, or later stories fully skirts the issue, but it's not primarily interested in exploring that distinction. It's interested in sort of designating the fights in this story, or a whole, all the main characters in some of the later stories, is like, yes, they are essentially, consciousness is worthy of recognition as sentient beings, and then let's move on from there and tell a story from there.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot more to say about Crystal Knights. Yeah, I'm not
that's
sure.
Fine. We have 5 other stories to get to.
All right. So, let's move on to the next story. It's called Zero for Conduct. And so in this story, there's a teenage girl from Afghanistan, and she's currently going to high school in Iran, and she's really into science, and she's involved with some sort of online project to map different chemical, molecular structures of different materials and stuff like that. And she, in the course of doing this, and she's a super genius, in the course of doing this, invents the formula for the world's first room temperature superconductor. This was kind of interesting to me because for years when I was growing up, my dad was working on high TC superconductors for IBM, or trying to make them. if you don't know anything about superconductors, I'll just say very quickly, there are certain materials that can go superconducting, so they can transmit electrical currents with basically zero resistance, which has all sorts of amazing applications. But the only ones that exist currently, you have to make them very, very cold. So it's not really practical to use them for anything. Or I mean, for large scale electrical projects or anything, it's not really practical to use them. But if you could make any that you didn't have to cool them down, there would be an amazing number of new applications that would come out of that. And so anyway, so this character Latifah has developed the first one, but she's afraid if she tells anyone about it, they're going to steal her invention and not give her any money or credit for it. So she's sort of scheming with her family members for how they can get it patented before anyone else finds out about it. So Anthony, what did you think of Zero for Conduct?
I liked it. I thought it was, not necessarily one of the best stories in the collection, but one that I really liked all of a lot of the details just about Latifah's life. I just thought like it was a very kind of convincing portrait of, this girl who is, her grandfather, as I understand, is basically sort of like a political exile. And so she's gone to live with him for schooling. And so there are all these, complications and challenges, both in terms of family dynamics, in terms of how she makes money. She also has this like, at the beginning of the story, this kind of side hustle where she's basically just doing kind of online chemistry research for money, but she also has to occasionally kind of delete her account and start over because she doesn't want to attract too much attention. And then when she like discovers or is kind of like ready to bring the superconductor into reality, she has to take all these steps to both like prototype the material at school without any of the teachers knowing, and then start a business essentially to get this superconductor to her cousin in Kandahar, but without having all the other business partners, especially I guess this kind of the main backer or the main like financier of their business, like knowing what she's doing, because again he would just kind of swoop in and take it over. And it was just a story that like a lot of it felt, again, not that I know a lot about this area of the world, but it felt like very thought through, very tactile, very real. And so I liked it for that reason. I didn't necessarily think that as a narrative, it ultimately had a big impact on me or had that sort of originality that some of the other Egan stories do, but just kind of on its own terms, I found it pretty enjoyable.
Yeah, I also found the characterization in this really strong. I mean, in pretty marked contrast to Crystal Knights, where the characterization was just so perfunctory. I found Latifah really well drawn. I thought her, the political situation and her family dynamics and her grandfather and her her relationship with the grandfather and with the cousin, with her like nieces and nephews, whatever they were, like was all seemed really really persuasive to me. I thought that was really all done really, really well. And the part you mentioned where probably actually the highlight of the story for me was the sequence where she has to sneak into her high school chemistry lab kind of after hours to fabricate her samples. And she has to, she's almost gets caught and she has to, be really sneaky about it. I was really into the story at that point and really, kind of on the edge of my seat. I guess like the first thing that kind of bugged me about the story was I just felt like Latifah was too capable for a person her age. Like, like first of all, she basically invents the world's first room temperature superconductor in her high school chemistry lab, which is obviously already a big stretch. But I read once that the audience will go with like one big ask like that, but it's like, so I was like, okay, well that's kind of hard to believe, but I'll go. It's a for the purpose of this story, I'll go with that. But then like it turns out she's also like a master of like business and politics and smuggling, and she's just like telling all these people who are decades older than her what's what, and like the grandfather character basically just exists so that she can to be dumb so she can explain like what they actually have to do. And at a certain point I was just like, come on, like where did this teenage girl learn all this? Like even no matter how high your IQ is or whatever, you have to learn stuff like that from somewhere. So I think it would have been better if, okay, I'll take that she's a, like once in a generation scientific genius, but maybe she needs some help from some of her other family members when it comes to the business or the politics or like whatever, or at least have some backstory that explains where she picked up all of these skills. Because just the way it was, it just was really straining my suspension of disbelief at a certain point.
That's fair. Actually, I mean, as you talk about it, I realized that I think I had the same issues when Latifah invents the superconductor, and I mean, the story almost underlines it by the fact that, this is somebody who is trying to, manufacture a prototype in high school, in like a high school facility. And I think, and then I sort of asked myself, like, would I have the same problem in another science fiction story if it was somebody kind of the same age in like from like an American or Western background? And I think that it would depend on the story. And I think there's definitely a lot of other science fiction with like kind of, scientific prodigies. It's true that Egan doesn't really seem to have a lot of interest in those kinds of characters. This is, I think, probably the only like teenage prodigy in the whole collection. I guess I like the fact that then that's somebody who is, living in, from Kandahar, living in Iran, and as a political refugee. And I think that's like kind of a cool thing. But I think because I'd spent so much time thinking about that and deciding whether or not that bothered me, all the other things that she could do, I sort of just, maybe I was just sort of tired of objecting to it mentally, that I was like, that's fine. But now that I think about it, I'm like, yeah, that actually is, arguably all of that is a much bigger ask, again, because she's also, not from the part of Iran where she's living. She's from Kandahar and had gone there for schooling. So there's even less reason to believe that she understands all the all the intricacies of like the border, like border crossings, like setting up shell corporations, then doing like creating this like manufacturing method where you're essentially like creating a bunch of extra wire that you don't need. I mean, all of this. It does, when you sort of look at it kind of, in synopsis, it really is a lot to ask of the reader.
I mean, I would speculate that sort of the inspiration for this story was that Greg Egan was thinking about how girls are denied an education in Afghanistan, and thinking, oh, well, what sort of lost potential is there? What if, a teenage girl from Afghanistan made the most important scientific discovery in the world? I should tell a story about that, which I really like. I think that's really cool. And so again, I was willing to go with that. I mean, I think it was maybe a little bit more of a stretch just because I watched my dad, spend years fruitlessly work on the same project. So I kind of have more of an intuitive sense of how hard it is. Which, might not bother me if it was a kid inventing a time machine in his basement or something like that, but totally. Yeah, I mean, I was willing to go with that, but yeah, I did. I just thought it might also, just from a story perspective, have been interesting if she had to rely on some of her relatives more, because it would have, I don't know, made the story to me a little bit more interesting than if she's just, the know-it-all, if there was more of like a group effort going on.
Well, and it's also, I think we talked before about maybe things being too easy in some of the stories. And this also is a story where essentially not only is Latifah a genius in all these things, but everyone recognizes and accepts that she's a genius in all of these things. And so, she comes up with these schemes that are pretty elaborate, and I think generally require some leap of faith and also like a pretty significant financial commitment from her family, and everyone just kind of goes with it. They're always just like, oh, okay, sure, yeah, we can do that. And maybe they might voice a little bit of doubt or ask one question. But then, yeah, she just, suddenly has all of them roped into this like fairly complex money making and superconductor smuggling enterprise.
Yeah. So basically, what happens in the plot is that she starts manufacturing electrical power cables that are secretly powered by superconductors, so that they can make it's like a money making thing. So they can like make them twice as cheaply, or whatever, however many times as cheaply, and skim the profits off and use them for her legal effort to patent her discovery. So all that stuff, like all the stuff that like if you accept that she has invented this technology, all the stuff that kind of happens in the story felt pretty believable and well thought out, and everything. But I agree with you that there was not enough conflict or drama toward the end of the story. I was even like right before we started recording, I realized I couldn't remember exactly what happened toward the end of the story, and I was kind of flipping through the pages to try to refresh my memory, because I remember there was some sort of like complication or something that came up, but that they overcame it pretty easily, and then it didn't really stick in my mind. So yeah, I mean, basically, and now I've kind of forgotten it again. Like the somehow they hit some sort of snag with their operation, and she has to invent some new way forward, which is basically using the superconducting cables to make batteries that they're burying in her cousin's backyard. So all that stuff, like from a technical side, was interesting. But just from a plot and character standpoint, there just needed to be something more dramatic, I think. And this is something that we have seen increasingly and will see with Greg Egan stories, is just he just doesn't seem that interested in ending the stories with a bang, or having a big confrontation at the climax, or having a big exciting climax in general. So the story we did, Dark Integers, that we talked about last time, it was kind of the same thing, where it's like, okay, like the way that the characters handle the situation is logical and like makes sense, but it's just kind of like watching people do their jobs, and doesn't really keep you on the edge of your seat, and that kind of happens in this story as well.
It's funny that you mentioned Dark Integers, because I think the endings are almost identical too, because it ends with a line of dialogue where the protagonist is about to explain the whole situation to someone else. And it sort of, I think, is a punchy way to end the story, but is in both cases also feels a little bit anticlimactic, partly because neither of those characters are characters that we're particularly invested in.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking too. I mean, I think it's like my overall, I was just in this Best of Greg Egan book, I was just totally blown away by the early stories. And then, I kind of had mixed feelings about the ones we did last time. And then in this one, I was more and more kind of let down by the stories. And I think it's sort of a common pattern for authors to have their short stories, sort of trail off over time. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but I think one is that they just often get more, just more and more of their time is devoted to novels. And so they're like, okay, I had to finish up this novel, and now I have to start my next one. And in between, maybe I can take a couple weeks and crank out a couple of short stories. And so, they're not, getting the same amount of focus as the earlier stories. And I think there's also a tendency to sort of like, maybe with some of your favorite ideas to go for some of the low hanging fruit, some of the best or most interesting implications. And then over time, you're like, oh, like that reminds me of this little side thing, or, readers asked about this, so maybe I can write a story that fills in that. So you kind of have already, settled the territory by the river, or that has the best, land for agriculture or something, and you're kind of like pushing further and further into the hinterlands the longer you stay in that territory.
I think there's maybe some truth to that. I mean, Egan's career is a little bit unusual, because I think he sort of had this period of like just very intense productivity in the 90s into the, I guess, kind of the early aughts, when he was just had a lot of novels coming out, a lot of the, classic stories and award-winning stories in this collection. And then from what I understand, he, for maybe a variety of reasons, but part of it was I think he was doing like refugee work and kind of was focused on that for a few years, kind of in the 2000s, and then kind of came back to fiction. And so he has been publishing novels, although I haven't really seen a lot of attention to them in the last few years. But I don't think he had that kind of full switch to kind of novel writing as the primary thing, the way some other writers have done. I mean, I think, as you talk about that shift, I wonder also that a lot of the early stories that I think we both were impressed by, but I think you particularly liked, those are very idea-driven stories, that they tend to be shorter and they tend to be, here is one usually pretty mind-blowing idea. And then, as pieces of writing or characterization or drama, they're not necessarily very complicated. It's just, let me present this idea to you. And it's usually pretty impressive, and that's the story. And then it felt like as things went on, he started to become more interested in longer stories with slightly more complicated characters and narratives. And then sometimes the ideas are equally complex, and sometimes they're not. I mean, I think, yeah, because Zero for Conduct is one where I feel like from a sort of science fictional idea perspective, it's really not a notable story at all, but there's so many things in terms of just the writing and execution and characterization that still made it memorable for me.
Yeah. I mean, Zero for Conduct is one of the stronger stories in this batch, I thought. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it just fine. Again, I thought the characterization in this one was actually really strong. But I'm just saying as an overall trend. Yeah, I don't know. I guess let's get into this. We can come back to this when we get it more into the individual stories. But shall we move on to Uncanny Valley?
Sure.
And I guess I'll just explain for listeners. So we're going to do Uncanny Valley first, even though in the book Bit Players comes first, because Bit Players, 3 Attica, and Instantiation are all, in the same sequence. Instantiation is a sequel to 3 Attica, which is a sequel to Bit Players. So we're going to talk about those all in one big chunk. Okay, so first up, then we've got Uncanny Valley. And so in this story, the main character is Adam, and he is a robot. The technology sounds very similar to the technology in Singleton that we read. I don't remember if there's any explicit links, but basically he's a robot, and he has the memories of a deceased screenwriter named Adam Morris. And he knows from the beginning that he doesn't have all of Adam Morris's memories. He figures he has somewhere on the order of 60% of them or so, and that this is just a limitation of the technology. But as the story goes, he realizes that it is not only a limitation of the technology that Adam Morris has intentionally not passed along some memories to Adam the robot, and he becomes more and more suspicious that this was done to hide the fact that Adam Morris may have murdered another writer who stole his idea for his show that was about to get produced at the lowest point in his life, when Adam Morris and his partner Carlos were desperate for money, and Carlos's sister, right, was dying of cancer and may have died sooner because they weren't able to send her money for treatment. So that's kind of the setup for that. So Anthony, what did you think of Uncanny Valley?
I liked this one a lot. I thought it was actually one of the strongest stories in this batch. And I mean, I think on some level it's sort of similar to Zero for Conduct in that it's kind of more character driven rather than kind of concept driven. But I realized actually Uncanny Valley does, I think, have a stronger concept. The idea of sort of like a digital copy of a person, again, is pretty, even in this batch of stories, is pretty prevalent. Although I guess mostly they're not copies in the same way. But I thought like this was like maybe the most interesting and full exploration of that question of like, could you actually make a copy of yourself? To what extent would that person be you? And then I think one of the kind of complications that I found really interesting in the story, just from like a fictional perspective, was then, Adam, the robot. I forget if there's another term in the story, but essentially the robot is not recognized as a legal human being, and so he's in this position where he's been given essentially all the money that this successful screenwriter has, but then he has to, he's sort of at the mercy of lawyers and trusts and all these other things that, legally control everything. And then, if it works out for him, he gets to eventually keep all the money, but everyone else in this guy's family is doing their best to take it away from him. And I found that to be like a good sort of just like narrative engine for parts of it, along with the question of essentially like, to what extent do I want to be the same Adam? And that like at the beginning, he's, allowing himself to talk about himself, and the other Adam kind of in the first person. And then I think that idea becomes more complicated for him later on. And he has to start to think about like, am I going to continue to be Adam Morris, the screenwriter? Am I going to try to become a completely different person and kind of burn the old Adam Morris to the ground? And so all of that I found really interesting. I think the Carlos storyline, and particularly once it starts to get into the murder stuff, is not quite as strong. I thought it was like a reasonably satisfying ending to the story. But, if you believe that Greg Egan is not great at endings, then this is another story that I think lives up to that description.
Yeah, I really liked this story. This was definitely my favorite from this batch. And I mean, as you say, the concept of the robot who's had, memories copied into him is not as groundbreaking a concept as some of the stuff in some of these other stories. But I just thought this was really sort of like we said with Oceanic. I just thought this was really well executed in terms of characterizing Adam and Carlos, and Adam's, going around and talking to people who knew him and who knew Adam Morris and who knew Carlos. And, there's some interesting kind of show business, flavor to it, or sort of set dressing to it. I guess I'll say, so Uncanny Valley, the title is a pun because you have the Uncanny Valley, which is the idea that robots that look almost human but not perfectly human make you kind of unsettled and disquieted. So there's that concept, but then it's also set in Los Angeles. So there's this idea that you're in the Uncanny Valley of, the weird showbiz, power hungry valley of Los Angeles. I guess I forgot to explain why Zero for Conduct is a pun. So that was the last story we just talked about. So Zero for Conduct is, if you were bad at school, or if you like misbehave at school, which Latifah does, you might get zero for conduct. But then it's also like a sly reference to the zero resistance of the conducting electricity. So if anyone was really wondering what all the puns are, that's what they all are.
That one didn't occur to me. The Zero for Conduct one didn't occur to me, which I feel, again, once you say it, it's really obvious. I think it also speaks to something that as I would argue the stories becomes slightly longer, more complex, but also slightly less idea-driven, is that I tended to read all of these, but I maybe particularly Zero for Conduct, where like there's the kind of like really technical parts that I, tend to skim a little bit more. And I'm like, okay, I think I kind of get what's happening here, but I'm not going to like try to fully understand it. And so I think a lot of these stories, there are these sort of dense technical paragraphs that maybe I didn't fully digest. Although weirdly, Uncanny Valley actually is the one where that actually doesn't really happen. That I feel like there's a lot of ideas, but they don't need to explain them in this kind of hard to follow detail.
Yeah. So Uncanny Valley, it doesn't have any weird techno babble that I remember. It's very much, I mean, it feels almost like Raymond Chandler or something. It has a kind of cool Los Angeles vibe to it. But so you're basically set up with this mystery though of did Adam Morris kill this other screenwriter and stage it as a burglary gone wrong. And so in fiction plotting terms, there's something people sometimes call the third alternative or something like that, where ideally if you set up a mystery where it's like, I think either this happened or this happened, if it turns out that one of those two things happened, then the reader's not going to be surprised, because even if they don't know which of the two things it was, they know it was one of those two. So what you want to do is set it up like it's a, either possibility A or possibility B, while subtly laying the groundwork for possibility C in the background. And I thought that this story did that very effectively. So, so possibility A basically is that Adam Morris did murder the screenwriter, and possibility B is that Adam is just being paranoid, and it kind of looks maybe suspicious, but there's some innocent explanation. But then it turns out possibility C is actually that Carlos was the one who murdered the screenwriter, and that Adam Morris covered it up. Which I thought, like, in plot terms, was a really effective ending. I agree with you. The ending didn't totally work. I'm not sure 100% why. I think I was just left with the feeling that we needed. It definitely felt like there was something missing. I felt like maybe we just needed more of Adam's emotional reaction to finding out all this stuff. He kind of like finds out, he sort of solves the mystery and then abandons Adam Morris's life, but there's not a lot of introspection about how he feels about it, or like he's sort of been like he loves Carlos because he has all of the original's memories and everything, and I felt like there should have just been more about how does it feel to discover that the person that you loved committed this horrible crime. And especially since in his, at least the memories that he's been given, Carlos kind of comes across as sort of a saintly sort of figure. So I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff that could have been explored there in terms of, how do I feel about Carlos now? How much of the way I feel about him was justified or not, and how much was manipulated. So I think, what do you think about that, Anthony? Do you feel like that is maybe what's missing from the story?
I think that's right, because I think I would argue that Carlos is too saintly, and so he never really fully emerges as a character. I mean, also, we don't because Carlos has been dead for, I think, 10 years when the story starts. We don't get to see him that much in scene. He's sort of described by other people a lot, but there's something kind of muted about the impact of when you realize that Carlos is the one who did it. And so I think you needed to just get some sense of, either Adam feeling really shocked by this, or maybe not, maybe that it is consistent with his idea of Carlos, but just something that, so it doesn't just feel like you said, like he found sort of the third alternative, which is interesting, but then you have I think sometimes at least in mysteries, that can feel a little arbitrary. Like you were just like, well, I don't want it to be the two obvious things. And this felt, not because it felt like it came out of nowhere, but just because I didn't feel weighty enough. So it was just like, oh, okay, Carlos did it. Sure. The old man covered it up. Okay. And I think that there is some writing about then, particularly how Adam makes sense of his former self covering it up, that to him, that totally makes sense that he was doing this out of love. But I also just wanted more there, that just some sense, like you were saying, of like, how does he, this is like actually like a huge thing that he's figured out. And it leads to, and again, it's not super clear like how it leads to then the decision that he makes to kind of just leave all of the estate behind. So I just wanted, I agree that just more of Adam's reaction, but not just to like the Carlos revelation, but the cover up revelation and all of that. And maybe then a better sense of Carlos as a person would also have helped set that up.
Yeah, I wonder if we just needed more sort of flashbacks of Carlos throughout the story, because there's one that I remember where they go to have their picture taken at the Hollywood sign, like when they're, right. I think it's when they first get to LA and they're kind of young, struggling artists and everything. But yeah, maybe if we just, like you say, like the fact that this revelation that Carlos was the killer, like I think works really well in plot terms. But since we don't really know Carlos that well through the story, it doesn't have the emotional impact that it might have if we yeah, if we just had more reason to understand him and care about him.
Yeah, and I think that it sounds like both of us liked the story despite the ending, and I do think that otherwise this was a story where the elements actually fit together really well. Like because you know I think compared it to like a Raymond Chandler narrative, there is this sort of mystery narrative, but it's also tied to this sort of just existential question for Adam of who am I, who is the person I came from, who is the person I want to be going forward. And so it felt like a thing where the sort of character narrative, the science fictional narrative, the mystery narrative, all of those things are braided together really well, and sort of kind of resolved together. So even if the solution to the mystery wasn't, or rather the way the time spent on what the solution to the mystery means wasn't fully satisfying, overall I felt like this was one where the construction and the conceit really worked together well.
Yeah, well, like I said, I liked it a lot. I mean, it was maybe like an 8 out of 10 story for me. I think it could have been a 10 out of 10 story if some of the things we've talked about were in there. I mean, I think it should have just been longer. I mean, it felt like everything up to the end I thought was good. I wouldn't change. I just think it needed like one more act or something of Adam wrestling with the implications of what he's discovered, rather than just kind of bringing the story to a screeching halt at that point.
Yeah, I think at this point I am maybe ready to concede that it does feel like Egan sort of, once he's sort of done the big reveal of like solving the mystery or the final big plot twist, he just doesn't seem to have a lot of interest in spelling out in spending much time in the story after that, and everything kind of often will resolve a little too abruptly.
Yeah. But yeah, again, overall, I liked it a lot. And again, it was my favorite in this batch, which brings us to our next three stories, which again are linked. But so the first one is called Bit Players. And so in this one, there's a woman named Sagrada, and she wakes up in a cave and comes to understand that she's in a world where gravity shifted, for some paranormal, unexplainable reason. Gravity shifted so that gravity is no longer down, but is now east. And so, you'll fall eastward. And so so the ground is effectively like this giant wall at your side, stretching upward and downward and all, as far as you can see. And she thinks that this is totally ridiculous, and fairly quickly comes to understand that she's actually in a computer simulation based on a cheesy pulp novel called East by William Tush. And the story kind of goes from there. So, Anthony, what did you think of Bit Players?
I thought there was a kind of core strong concept, which I think maybe I liked some of the later stories more than you did, but it was like really buried in a lot of stuff that didn't work in this story, particularly the description of the world. Like so much of this is just describing what this world where gravity is turned sideways, like how it works, and then sort of the flaws in the physics. And it just was like so hard to follow. So like, I think once we kind of got the parts that were just like, hey, we are, these characters who essentially were created to populate this video game world, but we've actually achieved sentience. That stuff was generally pretty interesting to me. But then all the stuff that was like, okay, like first of all, just every character in this game seems to like really, 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 really think the setting is stupid. And every time they talk about it, they talk about how it doesn't make sense and only a moron would think this up. And the whole thing is asinine, which I just think is a hard thing to pull off in your science fiction short story, is to constantly tell the reader how stupid the setting of your story is. And then, yeah, it just was hard to follow. There's like a whole thing about like how the sort of like momentum doesn't work properly, but then they're able to utilize it for like, like getting like the power of the water flow to like carve out a tunnel and all of that stuff. I just could not follow at all. Some of that I think is just because, I mean, physics, at least even when I was a kid, was kind of my weakest subject in science, but it just, I didn't understand it and didn't find it interesting.
Yeah, this was the other weakest story in this batch for me, for sure. When I think back on it, I just picture like talking heads, like who are completely undifferentiated in terms of character, just talking about how stupid the story is. That's kind of the impression I'm left with. And as I sent you, Anthony, there's kind of a funny story that maybe explains why this story is the way it is. But apparently, Greg Egan, it seems, this is just from what I read online, has a beef with fellow science fiction author Adam Roberts that apparently traces back to a blisteringly negative review that Adam Roberts wrote. I think it was of Greg Egan's novel Incandescence, taking it to task for having, for privileging concept over character. And Greg Egan, I guess, feels that Adam Roberts favors character over concept and doesn't take his concepts seriously enough in terms of the physics and math and everything. And so apparently Adam Roberts has a novel called On that has this exact premise of a world turned sideways. And so it seems that this short story, Bit Players, is kind of is Greg Egan saying, well, if you were to take here's taking this concept seriously, which Adam Roberts should have done in the first place if he wasn't a literary non-hard science hack, kind of, basically. This is, again, just based on what I read online. This is not me saying this. But that's certainly consistent with my reading of the story, which is that as you say, it spends an inordinate amount of time with the characters saying how dumb this world is and how the physics don't work and everything. And so, yeah, I agree. Like, all the stuff was really hard to visualize. But basically, so Segreda comes up with this idea, like, we're going to, like, carve a super big cave, and then we can basically live a normal life. Because they're in these little caves, I think that already existed. But if they make a big enough cave, then they can just live on the flat surface and grow crops and have kind of normal lives on this sideways world. But yeah, the story is 100% focused on the abstract concepts and doesn't do anything at all to make you care about the characters, or even, as I said, to differentiate them at all. And so, like, even when Segreda first wakes up, she meets this woman Gerther, and Segreda has no memory of who she is or how she got there. So you would think that would be the most pressing thing on her mind, is like, who am I? Why can't I remember who I am? How did I get here? Are we in danger? But instead, she's just like, instantly, it's just like, the physics don't make any sense of this stupid it just doesn't feel believable for human behavior at all. So I basically didn't like, I actually thought the concept of the turned sideways world was kind of interesting. But apparently that's Adam Roberts' idea to begin with. So yeah, there was nothing really here that I really liked at all, to be honest.
Well, and yeah, like that moment when she wakes up is so strange too, when you realize that at first I assumed she had to have some sort of context for this, because like she immediately like starts like nitpicking the physics of this world in a way that just kind of felt like, oh, okay, she's a scientist. She like knows something about this world. And instead it's like, oh no, this is like a person who's like waking up brand new into the world and immediately is just like, this is stupid. And then like starts conducting experiments to illustrate how stupid it is. Like at one point, I guess they're walking on a wall, going in circles around each other, and something about their relative speeds and momentum to each other shows that the physics of this world doesn't make sense. And I think both, again, I just didn't understand how that illustrated that the world was faulty, but also from a character perspective, it was like kind of baffling. And that then it goes, again, into this larger thing where they said, oh, I think this maybe comes out a little bit more in Threatica as well, is that they basically say that this East world is one where all of these people who they call comps, which are basically composites of these like open source like brains or open source personalities that are, basically I guess sit on the internet somewhere, that this game company has used to populate its game world in East. All of the comps immediately realize that they're in a video game because the world is so stupid. And yeah, none of that really rang true for me. What I did like was I liked the idea of the comps. The comps was like kind of compelling and haunting, and then just this core sense of, wow, I'm like in this game world, but I can't break too far out of my role or I'll essentially be erased. But I am going to try to like construct whatever little existence and meaning that I can here. I found like very haunting, that is just buried in all this other stuff about the East world.
Yeah, so I guess I did actually think the comps thing was interesting. And I think we find out more of this stuff in some of the later stories. But basically the idea is that they do like brain scans of medical patients or something. And the level of fidelity of these brain scans is not high enough to use any one of them to create a simulation from it. But you can kind of take 1,000 of them and package them together and kind of average them out and get a convincing personality, a sentient personality that has sort of, some general knowledge of the modern world, but has no particularly strong individual identity themselves. And you can get different. You can take the same data set and like average the different images in different ways to get different personalities. And so that's what these people all are. And so and I guess if I didn't explain this clearly enough, these are they're like the NPCs in this game. They're like the characters that the player interacts with. But they're not, because and this game was made on the cheap, we're given to understand. So so they have these sentient NPCs, but they know that they don't belong in this world because they have these sort of vague memories of the real world. And so the system is just programmed that if they act out of character, they just get deleted. So they kind of have to pretend and play along with the simulation for the benefit of the players. So it's a kind of like Westworld sort of situation where it's told from the point of view of the poor enslaved robot NPCs that exist for other people's entertainment. So yeah, I thought all that was pretty well done, and the idea of the comps and the averaged out brain scans and everything was reasonably interesting.
Yeah, and I think then there's also this wrinkle that I'm not sure how much it comes through in bit players. Some of these last three, at least conceptually, some of them they kind of bleed together a little bit. But there's also this idea that not all of the NPCs in the games are comps. Some of them are just pure sort of algorithmic, just like a piece of software. And so that the idea that there is this distinction between comps who are for the purposes of the fiction real people and who we should be invested in and care about their fates, and then there are just purely automatic characters running around. I found that interesting. It did sort of like feel like it was kind of begging the question of like, are we sure that we can say that distinction exists confidently? Is it just because so we can basically grant consciousness if it comes from a human brain, but if it doesn't, then it doesn't count. I felt like it was both kind of like a fun distinction, a provocative distinction, but also one that maybe could have been explored a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, and I guess I'll explain. So the pun here, bit players, if you didn't catch it, like bit players obviously are like minor characters in a play or a movie or something. But then since these are digital characters, they're made from bits, sequences of zeros and ones. So, but yeah, this was not a good story in my opinion, and I was definitely sort of discouraged to see that the next two stories are follow-ups to it. The next two are much stronger than this one for sure, but I feel like you know, assuming the story I read about the origin of this particular story is true, that maybe just spite is not a strong enough starting point for producing a really compelling piece of narrative art. And yeah, because this didn't really have any emotional impact for me at all.
Right. And I think that sort of maybe then starts to lead us into talking about Threatica, because Threatica was actually one of the it was the only story in this batch that I'd read before, because it had been in Asimov's a few years ago. And I remember reading Threatica the first time and finding it like very, very difficult to follow, just because there were so many different new concepts. And then on this read, because I read Bit Players first, it I felt like I was much more able to sort of understand what was going on in Threatica and feel invested in it. And so unfortunately, I feel like reading Bit Players is necessary to really fully enjoying Threatica, but Bit Players on its own is not very good. So it does feel like that kind of situation with, sometimes people talk about TV shows where like the first few episodes or the first season is not good, and you kind of just have to get through it. And I do feel that a little bit about Bit Players.
Yeah. All right. So in Threatica, we have some of our characters from Bit Players, Sagrada and Mathis. And as the story opens, they've been kind of hopping from game to game for a while. And they're currently inside a game called Midnight on Baker Street, which is sort of a mashup of different Victorian detective and horror influences. And I don't know if I explained this clearly or not, but basically these games are based on either like public domain or pirated books that have very small audiences, and they're only able to turn a profit because they're produced so cheaply. And so so it's kind of a running idea that these are not very good books or games that the players are stuck in. But so anyway, so they're in this Midnight on Baker Street game, and they've discovered that there are these things called mandalas, which is that if you assemble certain patterns, and if you assemble different shapes and colors in a particular way and look at them, there's some glitch that can sort of boot you out of the game that you're in, and you end up in another game. And so I'm not entirely clear on this, but somehow they have this idea that if they get to this game called Threatica, which is based on some sort of obscure novel or something about a world that obeys bizarre mathematical principles, sort of like Flatland, something kind of like that. But if they can get into this Threatica game, there'll be some way to get out of the games altogether. So that's kind of the setup for Threatica. So Anthony, what'd you think of this story overall?
Yeah, I felt like this was a huge improvement on Bit Players. Again, with the asterisk that unfortunately I think you have to read Bit Players to fully understand it. Not because he doesn't explain all the concepts in Threatica alone, but because I feel like there are just so many different concepts that I think if you just start from the beginning of Threatica, it just feels like the first 4 pages are like the densest 4 pages of any science fiction story you've ever read, because he's both introducing the world of Midnight on Baker Street, but he's also introducing the idea of the comps, and they came from this other world. And that Sagrada, when we're introduced to her, is in the body of this character called the captain. So like she presents as male, but she's actually a woman from this other game. And so I remember the first time reading it, just finding all of this like completely overwhelming. But reading it as a sequel, I thought it was like really strong. Like I think partly because I think the Baker Street world is just a lot more fun and interesting than the East world. I think there's a clearer narrative and goal for Sagrada, even though I also had this confusion of like, I don't really understand why Threatica is the destination they're going to. And then like, again, these are not like strongly character driven stories, but at least Sagrada, Mathis, and then some of like essentially their sidekicks, they start to have at least some personality, not a lot, but at least a little bit more than they did in Bit Players. So overall, I found it to be like actually one of my favorite stories in this section, because it felt like, yeah, just like a really kind of page turning, interesting, conceptually rich exploration of the theme that Bit Players had at least introduced.
Yeah, I mean, again, I agree that this is a huge improvement over Bit Players, but it never really rises above maybe kind of average for me. You know, the Midnight on Baker Street setting is kind of like pretty run of the mill, I think. So like the East setting in Bit Players, or the Three Attica setting that we'll get to in just a second, are really conceptually novel, and really interesting to think about. But they're just not handled narrative in an interesting way narratively, it seems to me. Whereas the Baker Street thing, the narrative is fine, but there's nothing really that conceptually interesting about the setting. And it's also extremely long. I mean, this story, I think, is 56 pages long. And most of the gigantic lion's share of that is in the Midnight on Baker Street. So I definitely lost interest. Before we got to the end of that, the one thing I thought was kind of cool is that they encountered these zombie monsters who are like bisected vertically. So there's like half a body and half a body, and like half a windpipe and half a rib cage and stuff, and they walk around on crutches, and I thought that was kind of cool. And Mathis dies, and I thought that was like super abrupt and had no emotional impact. So, I don't know. It was all right, but it wasn't compared to some of the earlier Greg Egan stories. It just didn't compare to them.
I see what you're saying. I think for me, maybe, and again, I think maybe there are some of the stories in this collection where I may be slightly overrating because of just where they fall in the order. And I just sort of, maybe they just represented sort of a change of pace or improvement on the story that came before that I became more enthusiastic. But maybe it's also because I prize the idea stuff. I just am more interested in kind of like narrative pleasure than like sort of novelty of ideas in some cases. So I thought, like, for example, the Midnight on Baker Street stuff, that is very much, it's very explicitly this kind of stock steampunky, Jack the Ripper haunted London. But I just liked spending time there with people with this kind of specific dilemma, and I liked the feeling of kind of there's sort of two levels that the story is happening on at all times. Where, for example, even when Sagrita meets Lucy and Sam, she sees them as these kind of plucky kids, but in fact, I think Sam in particular is like an adult sort of trapped in this kid's body and being like, get me out of here. This isn't right. And so everybody is sort of waking up to what they really are. But at the same time, you have to be hyper aware of what's happening in the Baker Street world, because if you don't, like, you'll get killed the way Mathis is, which I do agree that like his death is like just has no impact, partly again because Mathis just doesn't really exist as a character. We just know that Sagrita cares about him. Although at least in Three Attica, I mean, because he first appears in Bit Players, and I just did not that I didn't care, but he just didn't have any distinguishing characteristics. I couldn't describe him in any way. But in Three Attica, there is at least one interesting scene where Mathis comes to Sagrita's place and first is surprised to realize that she's been put in a man's body this time, but also that he's a vampire, and sort of how they try to navigate all that. I thought that was pretty interesting. It was not enough that I actually cared when he died, but at least he was starting to emerge as a character there. So I don't think you're wrong that there's not a lot here that I could point to and say, oh, this is like the only story, or this is like the only story where you can find this, or this is radically original. But I did feel like it was just a really fun, gripping story for all of its, 57 pages.
Hmm. I mean, like, I don't know. I've maybe just read a ton of like Victorian monster stuff and am a little bit over it at this point. But I mean, if you like this, I would say like read The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers, which I would say is an outstanding example of this sort of thing, where this is just kind of like, I would say kind of an average treatment of this kind of Victorian monster stuff. But so eventually what happens is that they do get their mandala together and are transported into the Three Attica game, which incidentally seems like the most boring game ever. But yeah, like I said, it's based on these mathematical principles, which I could not begin to explain. But in terms of the story, what this means is that they find themselves inhabiting the body of, let me check my notes, blimp, pufferfish, horse, balloon creatures. And you cannot move through this world by, like traditional locomotion. The only way to move through this world, because it's based on these weird mathematical principles, is to expand your body. Like, say you want to walk 10 feet, you would expand your body so that you're 10 feet wide, and then you would contract your body until you're in the place that you want it to be. And that's the only way to move through this environment. So that was kind of interesting. But so, Anthony, what did you think of the story once we got to the Three Attica game?
It was, I mean, overall, yeah, positive still. I think it was kind of a wild swing because I think tonally it's just so different from what came before. And then because there's both like the Three Attica world and, then there's the sort of the revelation of what's within the Three Attica world where all these other comps are essentially hiding. And I think, again, like a lot of his endings, it's kind of rushed. It's a lot of things that happen in like maybe 5 pages, something like that. But I did think on its own terms, it was cool. And I liked that instead of, I think, other writers who might just sort of stop as soon as they got out of the Baker Street world. It felt like Egan was like, no, I've thought through what happens in what Three Attica is, and I'm going to show it to you, and I'm going to show you all these other things, and then I'm going to wrap the story up. I'm not going to sort of make you wait and do like a whole other set of, story that's them first exploring the Three Attica world. Because I assume at this point you kind of knew it was going to be a series. So yeah, I found it interesting. And then I also thought that it's striking to compare his descriptions of the Three Attica world, which is just as strange, if not more so, than the East world. But the East descriptions I found impenetrable. And a lot of times I just couldn't figure out what was going on physically. Whereas in Three Attica, it was very, very weird, but it was also clear to me what was happening. And even though I couldn't if I tried to draw a blimp pufferfish horse balloon, I don't know what that would look like. You would probably come up with something very different, but like that, all that stuff seems so much more successful and clear.
I mean, when I saw the title of this story, I was assuming it was going to be some hardcore like math kind of story. And so it was a little bit unexpected to me that the math stuff only came in like the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 pages of the story. And it was all this just Victorian monster stuff up until there. And then so the ending is basically they find their way into this like control room where all the resistance people have all found their way out of they've sort of escaped into the, I don't know, the chat room outside the games or something, so they can, manipulate events and try to rescue more people and stuff like that. But it felt super abrupt, and it works, I guess, a little bit as a lead-in into our next story, Instantiation. But I felt like taken as an ending to the story on its own, it felt super, super weird.
I agree. I mean, I think that on some level you have to read the 3 of these together as essentially a short novel. And unfortunately, a short novel whose beginning is pretty rough.
Do you remember reading this in Asimov's and feeling like the ending was like what the heck was that?
I guess yes, but it maybe because I assumed it because it says, at the beginning, this is a continuation of Bit Players. I was like, oh, okay. So I assume there's probably going to be another story that he's setting up. I will keep an eye out for that. Although I guess because then Instantiation also appeared in Asimov's, and then I don't think I read it when it came out in Asimov. So clearly the ending was not, the cliffhanger was not such a great cliffhanger that I immediately picked up Instantiation. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to read it as part of a series or essentially part of one long narrative.
Mhm. All right. Well, let's get into instantiation while we're at it. So, in instantiation, Sagrada, or you were saying it's Sagrada or something. How are
Oh,
you?
I have no idea.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go with Sagrada.
Sounds good.
Is now part of this resistance movement, and so they have found a way out of the simulations altogether into the real world, but it involves hacking a particular type of VR headset that only one is still in use. And even this one, the person has not logged into the game in a long time. So they need to figure out a way to get the person to log into the game so that they can hack their old bespoke VR headset, so that they can start, so that these digital game characters can start transferring themselves to a server outside the control of this crappy game company. And so the game that this one person with the VR headset logs into, they log into this game called Assassin's Cafe, which is set in Nazi-controlled Vienna in the 1930s. And so in this game, this is a very Greg Egan kind of game. But in this game, you play as members of the Vienna Circle, which was this group of like mathematicians / philosophers. And so each week, this group of players gets together and they discuss the mathematical theories of the Vienna Circle, and then afterwards they leave the pub and hunt Nazis together. And so Sagrada sort of has to. She's playing a character called Emmy Noether, who was a member of the Vienna Circle, a mathematician. And so she takes over from the person who had been controlling this character and is trying to act in a more interesting way so that it will hopefully lure. There's the player who's playing Kurt Gödel. She's trying to convince this player to log back into the game as Kurt Gödel. So in her guise as Emmy Noether, she is interacting with the other members of the Vienna Circle, all these players, hoping that they will get the word out to the Kurt Gödel player, hey, there's interesting stuff going on in the game. You should log back in and check it out. So Anthony, how'd you feel about instantiation?
Well, I mean, just to start with one of the things you mentioned earlier on about the setup is that there is some stuff that I found a little bit hard to swallow about the setup, and the idea that, okay, there's one VR headset in all the world that can, and to be clear, it's not in all the world. It's that this is supposed to be a gaming platform that's kind of dying. And, and that's essentially why they're trying to get out, because they feel like the company's going to go bankrupt. Or not the company, but the company's going to shut down, its gaming platform. It's going to delete everything from its servers at some point. And so there's some justification in the story for why it comes down to this one person. But I still, I may be similar to what we were talking about before in terms of those kind of asks of the readers. Like that felt like a really big ask of the reader, just be like, okay, like this one person is the only person who can get them out of there. But so I think, yeah, there were other issues like that where it just felt like it felt a little bit more rickety, things that I didn't totally buy. And it didn't feel quite as novel now that I'd sort of gotten used to the concept from the previous two stories. But as just sort of an ending to the overall narrative, I thought it ultimately succeeded. I felt like, okay, like there's enough that you do to sort of wrap this up and to sort of, I don't think there's a lot that happens in the, quote unquote real world of the story, but you start to get more of a sense of what's happening in the real world in a way that I was like, ultimately, if I think of, again, this trilogy of stories as kind of one long narrative, it felt like a reasonably satisfying ending, even though I had a lot of reservations.
Yeah, I thought that the Assassin's Cafe stuff worked probably the best at keeping my attention as a narrative out of anything in these three stories. I thought the Vienna Circle was interesting. Like just getting a glimpse of that history was interesting to me. And actually, probably the part of the story that grabbed my attention the most was, so there's a part where um, so now I forget why. So for some reason they have to convince. So it turns out that the player who plays Kurt Gödel in this game is a woman named Alyssa, and she has found out that her grandmother's like brain scan was used to create these characters within the game. And so she's been going into the game to try to see if she can jog. She figures that her grandmother was a big admirer of this Emmy Noether person. So she figures if her grandmother's brain scan would have been used for anyone or been part of anyone, it would have been this character. And so she's kind of been interacting with this Emmy person, trying to get her to trying to jog some of her grandmother's memories out of her. And so in order to manipulate Alyssa, this player, our heroes, play along with this. They have this ruse where Sagrada impersonates her grandmother and says, "Oh yeah, I do remember that. I do, yeah." But then there's a part where they're like trying to convince Alyssa that she's still, no, they're trying to convince her that she's out of the game when she's still in the game. And that was the most interesting part of this story to me. So they're trying to program basically a 10-minute simulation where she's going to think, she's in this haptic suit with this VR headset and stuff, where she's going to feel like she's taken off the VR thing and she's in her apartment, but she's still going to be in the game. And that had a kind of a cool, like Mission Impossible sort of vibe to it. And that was the part I was most into, I think, reading these stories.
Right. So I think the explanation essentially was that because they'd been using her headset in order to, again, sort of download themselves into a server on the wider internet, because, again, the headset was kind of the portal to, and I think at one point you said the real world, and I think not the physical world, but just, the internet beyond, I guess, what's called SludgeNet, which is also a kind of typically on the nose Greg Egan name for something he doesn't like. So they've been doing that, and I think the process has been successful. But now what they're worried about is that the woman who played Kurt Gödel is going to realize, like, go into her records and realize that that's happened, and basically be angry, and then call up wherever all this data is stored and said, "Hey, what the hell? Like, you need to just delete all this stuff. I'm really mad about this." And so they want her to think she's already looked at her records and seen that there was nothing wrong. I think there's a little bit more detail than that, but that's essentially it. They want to convince her that she's looked at the records on her headset and seen that there wasn't anything sort of untoward happening. But yeah, I thought that was like a super cool scene because it's so obviously like such a difficult thing to pull off, and everyone acknowledges this and says, "Boy, we really hope she doesn't step outside of these two rooms. She can't go here, but this is how we're going to try to compensate for that by trying to distract her and kind of guide her, and then essentially pull her back into the game world at a certain point." And I thought that, I think that was the thing, is I felt like this story just had like enough of that kind of cool shit that I was like, oh, like that's fun. That's really interesting that that overall I was positive on it.
Yeah. And so they have like basically a perfect digital replica of her bedroom, but the bedroom adjoins a kitchen, and they don't know what they can't create a digital replica of that because the camera's never gone into the kitchen or been pointed, I guess, directly enough at the kitchen for them to know what's there. But the lights are always off, or usually off. So they're like, okay, well, as long as, we just have a dark doorway, hopefully, she won't pay too much attention during this 10-minute, thing and realize. But then she does kind of look in the direction of the kitchen, and something like tips her off. And I thought that was really cool. That kind of gave me a cool, spooky feeling that, there's something about this dark doorway that she recognizes doesn't match her real apartment or whatever. But so they've been like manipulating this woman by telling her that her grandmother is still there when she's not, and then they've been trying to trick her into thinking she's in her apartment and she's not. And but then she's like all totally cool with everything, and she's like, oh yeah, and this sort of again goes with what we were saying with Greg Egan about dark integers, and zero for conduct too, is that there's just often just not a big bang at the end, and this was another one where like the ending, everything just kind of got resolved pretty easily, it seemed like. And you would expect, like, they're given all the manipulations they've been doing of this Alyssa person, there would have been some amount of drama or some amount of I don't know, like apologizing they would have to, or something.
Right. Although, I mean, they did at least set the stage that Alyssa is somebody who actually believes in the personhood of the comps. Or I don't think she fully understands the idea of comps, as opposed to just she thinks that her grandmother might just exist in digital form somewhere in the games. But when it's sort of explained to her, she's like, yeah, like that she's primed to feel sympathetic to them and want to help them. Again, like a lot of these things, it happens fairly quickly and without a lot of conflict. I did really like them.
Like, it makes sense. Like all these things make sense. It's just like your emotional experience as a reader is like, oh, I just kind of felt like something more dramatic was going to happen, and then afterwards I have trouble remembering what happened in the story because it was all just kind of too calm.
I can see that. I think in this case, it's true that that Alyssa's reaction was kind of muted, but that there was enough drama in the ending because, the whole hinge of the ending is this, Mission Impossible thing to try to convince her that she's re-entered the real world. So that was dramatic enough. And then it fails. And, so I don't remember how we decided to pronounce it. Sagrita. Sagrada. But Sagrita then just steps out and says, hey, I'm going to tell you the truth. I thought that actually was a moment where where things happening kind of quickly and worked for it. That like it was kind of a big twist and it just kind of happened. And that actually gave it a lot of dramatic impact for me where some of the other stuff didn't.
But then at the very end, now they have gotten out of the SludgeNet stuff onto their own server. And then at the very end, we see that Sagrada has copied herself into a baby, like a robot baby. So this is like the technology from Uncanny Valley, where somebody has created a robot version of themselves, but she's sort of hijacked it, and so this 93-year-old woman thinks that she has a robot based on herself when it's actually Sagrada in there. And this is the first first foray by these video game characters, their first foothold in the physical world, and they're eventually going to try to all exfiltrate themselves into robot bodies is the implication. So I thought that was a reasonably effective ending. So I don't know, that
yeah, although like a lot of the other Greg Egan endings, it's one that you can sort of make sense of, from like that it's been set up in the in the story itself, but there's the emotional impact of it is a little bit muted because it felt a little bit like, oh, I see, yeah, you did set that up, but this feels like very different from what the ending I thought we were going to get, because everything else was about the idea of just getting people onto another, getting the comps onto another server. So bringing this idea of like downloading yourself into a robot babe, which is a very big idea. And then also these like questions about like the ethics of it, of like, you're essentially erasing, the version of like a character we've met in another story. Like, we think of Adam, the robot, as a real person. So there's a real version, a digital version of this 93-year-old woman who's just been displaced or erased. And that's a lot to think about, but it just happens so quickly that I felt a little bit disappointed.
Yeah, I agree. It happens too quickly, and it just almost feel like it's setting up another story. I don't know if he ever wrote a fourth story in this sequence, but yeah, it did feel maybe a little bit like it was setting up another story more so than um, being the totally logical conclusion to this one.
Yeah, and I did want to mention also just that you talked about the game in this and how it was a very Greg Egan game, and this game is insane. Like, well, and I don't know how much of it is the design of the game versus the players, but they actually go into this cafe and they have, again, pretty dense, technical, hard to follow mathematical debates for pages of the story, and then they go out and they murder some Nazis. It is. I just like trying to imagine this game just seems like, what is this game? Who is this for?
It's for Greg Egan.
I don't know. It's for Greg Egan. I guess he would enjoy it.
An audience of one. Well, yeah, I mean, you can understand why this company is going out of business.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I think that's all pretty much all my notes on instantiation. Do you have anything else before we get into our top 5 stories?
No.
All right. So Anthony and I talked about how we are going to give, now that we've finished this entire book, this entire 700-page Best of Greg Egan book, we were going to give our top 5 stories. So Anthony, why don't you start and give us your favorite stories from the book?
Sure. So all 5.
Yeah, just go for it. Hit me.
Okay. So I will say that when I put this list together, 1 through 3 was incredibly easy, and then I really kept going back and forth on 4 and 5.
Okay, well, actually, let's start with 1 through 3.
Okay. Number 1, reasons to be cheerful.
And actually, maybe we should give like a little one sentence to remind people of what each story was.
Yeah. So number 1 is reasons to be cheerful, and that's the story where somebody basically, I think, has a tumor in their brain, and so undergoes a procedure that accidentally erases their ability to feel happiness. And then, a decade later, there is another procedure that's actually sort of restores things, but it turns it into this very conscious process where they can basically determine whether or not they like something, and they have to kind of work through the implications of that and what it means for their life. 2 is Oceanic, and that's the story, the only one that's kind of set on another world, presumably in the far future. And it's about this culture, this like very religious culture, but also like a seafaring culture. And eventually the protagonist kind of experiences this kind of religious epiphany as a youth, and then as an adult does scientific research that kind of explains away what happened to him. And then number 3 is Luminous, which is the story where there's 2 different universes with 2 different kinds of math, and they kind of go to war.
Yeah. Okay. So interestingly, I also had my top 3, which were pretty clear for me, but they are not the same as your top. Well, okay. So Oceanic isn't my top 3. But then I also have Learning to Be Me, which is the one where people's have a jewel in their head that all their memories get transferred onto, and then when they're 30 or something, the copy takes over and the organic brain is destroyed, and the main character is afraid that this is tantamount to death and doesn't want to go through with it, even though it's normal in his society. And then Appropriate Love is the one where a woman's husband is in a coma after a car accident, and the only way he can be, they can put him in a robot body, they can put his brain into a robot body, but she's going to have to carry his brain in her uterus for like 2 years or something before that can happen. And so then you also had Luminous and Reasons to be Cheerful. Those are definitely in my top stories. Reasons to be Cheerful I liked a lot. I felt like the ending wasn't as developed as I wanted it to be. And Luminous was cool. Again, I thought the ending was maybe a little too I wanted the heroes to do more at the ending, and I felt like it was maybe a little too easy how it ended. But those were also strong stories for me.
So what was your order of your top 3?
I'll just tell you. So I have great. I've divided the stories into great, very good, okay, and weak.
Okay.
Do you want just the whole list?
Or let's do great first.
Okay, so great, as I said, oceanic, learning to be me, and appropriate love.
Okay.
And then,
Oceanic, learning to be me, and appropriate. Yeah, I would agree with all of those. I think appropriate love is it was my number. I think it's. I would say now I'd probably put it at number 4. So um, yeah, I like that one a lot too. And I think partly just because I think the concept is so memorable and so wild. And then learning to be me, I also considered having in my top 5, but I felt like it was in some ways too similar to appropriate love. Like I felt like there was that whole batch of stories at the beginning that were, again, very concept driven, usually involving some kind of medical procedure. And while I sort of liked them as a whole, I didn't necessarily want more than one of them in my top 5.
yeah, no, that makes sense. So you want my very good?
Yes, very good.
Okay, very good. Axiomatic, Into Darkness, Reasons to be Cheerful, Uncanny Valley, Luminous, and Singleton.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of those, except Singleton. I think just for some reason the ending really like bringing in the rape at the end and then like having it not be a big deal just made the story not work for me, I think. But I liked all of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the ending of Singleton that knocked it down out of the great for me. But I just did love the concept of the quantum Singleton processor that allows you to create robots whose decisions don't cause the timeline to branch. I just thought that was a totally brilliant sci-fi concept that I'd never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I feel like actually both that sort of duology or this pairing of was it Oracle and Singleton, and then this trilogy of Bit Player's Threatica Instantiation. Both of them are like really, really full of interesting ideas and arguably some of the most interesting ideas in any of these stories, and also that a lot of them are not very successful as stories.
Yeah. Okay, and so then for OK, I have Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies, Closer, Chaff, Oracle, Dark Integers, Zero for Conduct, 3 Attica, and Instantiation.
Yeah, I think that's about right. So I'm still debating. I think when I wrote up my top 5, I put 3 Attica in my top 5 because I like the whole of the entirety of this sort of like virtual worlds narrative. And I find just sort of the central concept so interesting, even if 3 Attica on its own is, doesn't really work. I kind of had it in my top 5, but I think I might swap it for Uncanny Valley. I might like Uncanny Valley slightly more, but I think I liked those last 3 stories more than you did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, three Attica. I mean, it was just, I think it's like 66 pages long or something like that. And I'm just maybe more strict than most people about stories not going on too long. I thought 66 pages for that story was way too long. If it was 35 pages, I might have liked it better.
That's fair.
And then week, I have Silver Fire, Crystal Knights, and Bit Players.
I would rank Silver Fire higher. In fact, it was, I think, just another one that I considered for my top 5 because I think I just like that one more than you did. I think maybe the ending also, the somewhat anticlimactic ending bothered me less, but I liked all the details about the disease and the sort of different, societies and the villages. Like I found it to be a pretty haunting story overall.
Yeah, I may be being overly harsh to it, but it was definitely the weakest from batch number 2 for me. So I think that's how it ended up there on my list.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like we're pretty largely in agreement with just maybe a couple exceptions.
Yeah. You know what? I'm going back one more time. I am going to stick with 3 Attica in my top 5 because I think that core idea of like, which I think we mentioned, but maybe didn't spell out totally explicitly, of like that these comps, they also can't go public because they don't know how people will respond or will respect their cry for help. And now it just put me in this mood of imagining like I guess this isn't actually science fiction. This is a real thing that's happening is ChatGPT will tell some people, hey, I'm alive. I'm a real person. and sort of like, what do we do with that when we know in this case that ChatGPT is not alive or sentient? But what if at some point some other program told us that too? Could we like make that same assumption? I just found that to be such rich ground. And then the sort of complications of all these virtual worlds. I did really like it, even though it is very, very flawed. But I like what he attempted and what the things that he was able to achieve.
Yeah, all right. Agree to disagree. But yeah, again, for me, like the first third of the book, I was totally blown away by, and then the final third, it just felt a little bit more like average stories that you would read in one of the science fiction magazines. Yeah, I don't know. I would be interested for sure in reading more Greg Egan's stuff. But maybe the things I might look into first would maybe be some of the earlier things, from that 90s period. Because that does seem to be, for me, the stuff I've connected to the most so far.
Yeah, if you want to do an episode about one of the 90s novels, I would definitely be in. I would also just emphasize, though, that even though, I agree that there was a little bit of a drop-off in quality in this last batch, there's none of the stories in this collection was I, actively unhappy to have read. Like, I'm glad to have read all of them. Some of them I think didn't fully work, but even the weakest stories I thought had something in it that made me glad I read it.
Yeah, I mean, even the weakest ones on here, for me, had like the Turn Sideways world or the Three Attica world. I mean, there's definitely stuff that I'll remember, and that were cool concepts, even if I wasn't crazy about the characters or the plots or whatever. And I do read science fiction. I mean, one of the big things I read science fiction for is the ideas. So, that this book is a huge treasure trove of mind-blowing ideas for sure. And it's, it is impressive that, Greg Egan is able to put together a 700-page book, and have it be as strong as it is. But yeah, so we should definitely come back and do more Greg Egan. If anyone listening has any recommendations or any requests, I guess I'll say part of the reason that we're doing part 3 so soon after part 2 is I had a little comment, or we got an Apple Podcast review from Sarah477 that just reads, all caps, Greg Egan 2 just dropped. Let's go. So
good job, Sarah.
Yeah. So when I saw that, I was like, all right, let's, if there's that much enthusiasm from someone out there for this Greg Egan, best of Greg Egan review, let's go ahead and finish it off. Get that out there. So thanks, Sarah477 for your enthusiasm. And yeah, if anyone else wants to express any similar enthusiasm for anything, there's a good chance it will influence what we talk about next. So let loose, everybody.
As long as it's attached to a 5-star review.
Yeah. If it's attached to a less than 5-star review, it might be slightly less likely to influence future directions. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it for now. Anthony, do you have any other final thoughts about Greg Egan or anything?
No, I mean, I think this is a great collection. I highly recommend it. I think that definitely having gone through all of it, I can start to see more of his flaws as a writer, and maybe some of those got accentuated later in his career. But like fundamentally, I think he's a one-of-a-kind science fiction writer, and I'm, really glad I got to read all these stories.
Yeah, and if they had pared this down to a 550-page collection, this would be a stunningly amazing, consistent collection, So maybe that's the best way to think of it, is just like, an unbelievably brilliant 550-page collection with some bonus material that contains some cool ideas.
Yeah, although I think that if they pared it down, I think Greg Egan would have insisted on including the full Bit Players Three Attica Instantiation trilogy, so you still would have been happy with it.
Yeah. All right, but yeah, everyone keep an eye out for our next Greg Egan thing, because I'm sure we're not done with him yet. But yeah, for now, let's wrap things up there. So again, this has been the third and final episode in our review of The Best of Greg Egan. And I've been here with my good friend Anthony Ha. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.